In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the steering tube assembly as well as all of the clutch components that go along with that, and then afterwards show you how to adjust everything to get it back on the water. The useful tools to have for this job are a 7/64 hex, 1/4 inch, 3/16, and a 5/32 T-handle hex, as well as a 1/8 to get the handle off. And then it's good to have a couple of screwdrivers, a Phillips and a flathead screwdriver, a knife, and red Loctite. And if you're adjusting the clutch, you'll also need a 5/16 wrench as well. So first step with this job, clear the room, pull the seat off. And we're going to be removing the well. There's two 3/16 hexes at the front we need to undo. All right, and a 5/32 at the back of the well. Then you're going to have to undo the two clutch bolts. Those are 5/32, but it's good to have a small key that you can turn inside of the well. Go ahead and remove those clutch bolts completely. Put them aside. And then this is now ready to move up. It might help to take one of those T-handles and just pop it inside of this crack here. And just move that corner away a little bit to get it to clear the clamshell. And then pop up. And just put this aside. Next step is going to be to remove the clutch. And all you do is just rotate this clamshell just slightly to give it clearance to fall down and pull down on the clutch, and it will just easily pull out. And put that aside as well. Okay, now take a 7/64 hex and undo the clutch clamshell. All right, now once that's free, go ahead and pull the top cover off and then just push this down and out of the way. And watch out because there's two small pins and rollers in there, don't lose those. And there is the clutch belt drum. Last step here is to take this spacer that slides in the middle of the two sides of the belt and just rotate it slightly so you can bend it a little bit and get it out of the way. You may notice when you take the old spacer out that it may have an end that's squared off like this, or it may have an end with a tab sticking out. Either way, you're going to be replacing it with a new spacer. Next step is going to be to take this side of the handle off and these steering handles. So go ahead and take a knife and pop this 360 dome sticker off, put it aside. Get your 1/8 hex and undo the top screw on the handle. Pull directly up and wiggle it a little bit. It comes off. Slide this pin out. Pull directly up on the rudder handle. Now take your 1/4 inch hex and undo the back side of the H-rail. Take your Phillips screwdriver and undo the two screws that hold this H-rail mount on. going to have to pull those screws completely out. Once they're out, this cover, pull the edges of it out, and then you're able to just pull straight up on it. There's one more screw at the front of the H-rail. Now you'll be able to remove the whole assembly. It helps to remove this mount as well. There's a 1/4 inch hex. All right. Okay. Next step is going to be to remove the steering tube and steering box assembly. So there's going to be some pieces of foam in the way you're going to have to remove. So open the center hatch. One of the pieces of foam is right here, a round one underneath the seat mount. Just give yourself a little more clearance to work. And the other one is right here, and it kind of goes around the compression tube. It has this cut out in it. Okay, and the last foam piece is in the gunnel. And there are 2 Phillips head screws holding it in place. So go ahead and pop those out. This just helps to get clearance to be able to put the cranks in the gunnel when you're lining everything up. Okay. And then just notice where that foam piece ends. It basically butts up against this BOA reel. So I'm just going to pull down. There it is. Just put this aside. Okay. So before we can pull this assembly out, we also need to detach the rudder steering lines. So if your BOA is tight, go ahead and pull out on it and release it. That'll give us the slack we need in the steering line to be able to release the ends of those lines from the crank. They're just looped around a little rivet. Got the front one off and the back one off. So they just look like this. And they go around this rivet on the crank. So you're in there just pulling them off, and there's 2 of them. So keep in mind, if you pull the wrong one off first, it might get caught and you might need to pull the other one off. So it's a little trial and error, but it shouldn't be too bad. Okay, so now those are both released. Next step is to remove or loosen the bolt that holds the compression tube firmly into the steering box. It's this 5/32 here, and that's going to allow us to remove the compression tube. So that's directly underneath the cranks here. Don't need to remove it completely, just loosen it. Once that's loose, you'll be able to, either from here or here, twist the compression tube here, and twisting it will release it from the steering box. Sometimes it helps to sort of use your thumb to push against the box here to get a little bit more clearance. So that's now coming out the front here. And I'm going to go ahead and pull the belt all the way through it since we're replacing this whole system. And I'm just going to pull down on the steering box, and these cranks will feed out. And that assembly is removed. And then the compression tube pulls back inside the inside of the hull. And then you can remove it through the hatch. Okay, that's done. Now that we've pulled out the old system and we're ready to replace the steering tube assembly, we want to make sure we have all the components. It should come with this steering box with the belt, the rudder crank on the outside of the 360 crank. It should also have the compression tube spacer and the compression tube. As I mentioned before, the compression tube spacer may look a little different than the original, and that's fine. You should also have a clutch assembly, including the clutch belt drum and these clamshell components. It's very important that you don't reuse the old components. The new ones have this rib because of the modification to the design of the spacer, and if you use the old one, it won't work properly. So make sure that these are all included in your kit and that you use all of the new components and put the old stuff aside. So, first step is to assemble the belt into the compression tube with the compression tube spacer. And the nice handy way to do this is to use the spacer to push the belt through. Before we do this, you want to make sure that the side that has the black line is away from the steering box, and the side that has the angled cut on it is next to the steering box. So the easiest way to do this is take the steering box and belt, put the spacer on the inside of the loop of the belt, and then use that to run the belt through. And do this gently. These belts don't like being kinked. They don't like being forced. So just make sure you're doing everything gently. Okay, now that that's all the way through, the next step is going to be to put this system inside of the hull with the tip of the crank facing the stern, and then we're going to feed the tip of the compression tube back out through the hole in the well, and then we're going to feed the cranks up through the hole in the gunnel. So go ahead and open the hatch. Crank first, back towards the stern. Then you also want to make sure that the rubber hose that's zip tied around the hole in the boat is still in place, and you're going to be feeding the end of the compression tube through that. There we go. So, as I do this, you'll see it start to come out into the well here. That's fine. Now we're going to feed it more than we need to so we can get this crank up through the gunnel. So what I'm going to be doing is feeding the crank up like this, and it may help to take a tool, let's say this hex, to help you grab the end of it and pull it up through the hole. So I can see the end of it. That was actually very easy, but if it's not easy, you can always, if you can see the end of it, you can push this through and just help it to feed it up through the gunnel. Okay, now that that's in place, the next step is to press the end of the compression tube into the steering box. And again, be careful with the belt as you're doing this. These things are delicate, they're strong, but they're easy to damage. So just take your time, make sure nothing's twisted. There we go. Feed it back through. Okay, I've got it attached. Now, to make sure it's all the way in, I can come to this side, put my thumb around the belt, and just give it a little pull. You'll see that the spacer here needs to be aligned vertically for it to fit all the way inside of the tube. There should be about 1/4 inch of it sticking out, but if it's like this, it'll stop at about 1/2 inch. So make sure it's vertical, and then you'll see now it's around 1/4 inch sticking out. Then I'm going to go ahead and make sure that the black line on the compression tube is on the top of the tube. That's in its most compressed state, and that's how you're going to be able to assemble everything. Okay, So next step is to reassemble the H-rail. And first step is to put the mount in place with the 1/4 inch hex. Okay, and then go ahead and attach the Phillips head screw on the front. You don't need to tighten it all the way yet, just attach it. Okay, now I'm going to make sure that this crank feeds through, so I'll just reach inside the hatch and that. There we go. So that works properly. And I'll take the top end of the mount and rotate it so it's in line with this lower mount, and you can just press this over the top like this. Oh, lost a nut. Okay, I'll go ahead and, while I'm here, screw these screws back into the mount. There we go. That's one. The other. Sometimes these can be hard to line up, but this one seems pretty good. If you do have trouble, it can help to use a drill to get a little speed. Okay, that's attached. So we'll go ahead and tighten the 1/4 inch hex at the back of the H-rail. Okay. Finish tightening the Phillips head at the front. All right, that's all back together. Might as well put the handles on while we're here. So I just want to make sure that this has the crank facing out. So we're facing in. So you'll have one of these notches on the front side. The crank will be facing in here. The other one's at the back. I can line up this handle, slot it down over those pieces. There we go. Now I can feed the pin through here. That'll hold it in place. Pull up a little bit, make sure everything's seated nicely, and then make sure the pin is centered. Go ahead and put this on top. Take the 1/8 inch hex key and start screwing in that screw. Now that screw may bite, or you may find you need to reach inside and pull up on the assembly. For me, it's just twisting, nothing's happening, so go in here and pull up. And that little extra room should give me the room to tighten it. There it goes. Okay, once that's tight, I can put the sticker back on. Okay. After you've attached the H-rail and the steering handles, it's time to reattach the line to the rudder steering. Make sure that your boa is released, and then there are 2 lines. One comes around the rear of the hatch and around a pulley on the boa and back to the crank. The other one's coming from the backside. Make sure when you run the line that's coming around the boa pulley that you run it over the top side of the compression tube, the gray tube you just installed. If you run it on the bottom side, it has to loop underneath it, and that takes up some of the slack, and you won't be able to get them both on. It'll also cause extra friction in the steering. So I'm just making sure this one's going over the top of that tube. And this rectangular hatch, you can get your whole head in. So it's nice to be able to check, and that's correct. So go ahead and attach that onto the handle. Now that you've installed all of the mechanical elements on the inside of the hull, we can move to the clutch and the well. First step is going to be to install this clamshell component as well as the clutch belt drum. So go ahead and feed this clutch belt drum into the inside of the loop of the belt, making sure you get the teeth engaged. And make sure that the black line is on the top of the compression tube and that the compression tube spacer is fully inserted and locked into the detents on the steering tube. So you should have about 1/4 inch of it sticking out. If you have more sticking out, just make sure it's vertical and move it around a little bit. You should be good to go. If you have trouble doing this next step, you may find that this is not all the way, the compression tube spacer is not all the way locked into the steering box, and you can just wiggle a little more and get that in place. So go ahead and pinch the belt together and feed the clamshell over it, and make sure that everything seats nicely here. There's a small recess that the compression tube spacer locks into on both of these clamshell components. Next step is to put the top on. And when you do this, it's easiest to get the top of this pin lined up with the hole for that pin first, and then to use a flathead screwdriver to get the other side lined up. So I go ahead and wiggle this around, make sure the two sides of the clamshell here are touching. As you can see here, this side is still open, which means that the pin hasn't quite found its home. So I go ahead and take this flat screwdriver, just press it until it locks in place. Now I'll take that 7/64 hex and tighten these up. Make sure that you fully tighten these, but don't tighten them so hard that you strip the plastic. You just want to make sure that the two sides of the clamshell are touching. That's one side, do the other. At this point, I would also add a zip tie to this system. I've noticed on some of the systems coming out that it's possible to have these parts flex away from each other. Sometimes that's because these screws aren't tight enough. Sometimes it's because of where the clutch is sitting. But I just think it's a good idea at this point to put a zip tie over the clamshell where these two pieces come together on the compression tube. One little trick I've noticed too is you can also pop this off once you've gotten as tight as you can, tighten it a little bit more, and then pop it back over. That'll help it to stay in place. Go ahead and cut the end of that off so it doesn't interfere with anything. And fold that down. Okay. Now if you want to test to make sure everything's working properly at this point, you can take the clutch, put it in backwards like this, and that holds the belt drum in place, and you can twist this and make sure everything's working. It should be nice and easy to twist, and it is. So our next step here is going to be to attach the clutch to the underside of the clamshell, and then we'll be able to put the well in place and bolt everything together. So if you can rotate this slightly, it helps. Don't rotate it all the way because that's bending the compression tube spacer. It's twisting it. But you can see this tine sticking out here. You just want to feed that in between the two sides of the spring. But in general, you can just sort of like wiggle it and line it up. Okay. Now that that's in place, go ahead and feed the well over the top. So this is quite easy, but just make sure that as you do this that you hold the clutch up in place and press down and make sure that the top of the clutch shaft fits through the hole on the well like this. That's all good to go. So now before tightening the 3 main bolts for the well, go ahead and make sure that you can get these screws in place. And when you put them on, go ahead and put a little bit of blue or red Loctite. Because these screws, when they're put in, are not tightened fully. They're adjustment points. And it's more likely that they could back out than a tightened bolt. Go ahead and feed that in. Use that 5/32 hex key to turn it in place. Okay. You don't need to tighten these all the way right now, just make sure that they're engaged with the nuts before tightening the rest of the bolts down. Okay. Now we can go ahead and take the 3/16 hex and tighten the 2 front bolts. And I tend not to tighten these all the way until I know they're all engaged. It just makes it easier to get everything on. Go ahead and make sure this one is started before tightening those. Okay, just make sure they're snug. All right, those bolts are all in. Now go ahead and finish tightening these. The back one we want to tighten and then back off a couple turns, and then we're going to adjust that in a minute. The front one I would tighten all the way and back it off a half turn, and I'll talk about adjusting it on the water. There are 3 adjustments on the clutch: the rear clutch bolt, the front clutch bolt, and the brace screw on the back. The rear clutch bolt, which is closer to the stern of the kayak, can be adjusted to change where this gear resides compared to the gear on the drive. If it's tight to pull the drive in and out as you release it from the hull, or if you're finding there's extra friction when you steer, it might mean that these 2 gears are pushing too hard against each other. So backing this screw off by as far as 3 turns will allow this gear to move away from the drive. The front clutch bolt is the clutch slip, and what it does is, as you tighten it, it clamps the clutch system tight. So if that's not clamped at all, it allows the whole clutch system to spin within this clamp, but tightening it locks it in place. The purpose of this is in some sort of overpowered situation where you hit the lower unit on something as you're pedaling around, or drag the boat on the beach, or any number of things. It allows the whole system to slip instead of relying on the clutch to take all of that load, and avoids potential damage to the clutch. The last adjustment is the brace screw, which is on the back side. And what that does is, in certain situations, the 2 gears on the system could end up starting to ramp away from each other. So under high loading, this gear may actually try to move away from the gear on the drive. And in that case, this brace screw will touch the hull of the kayak, and it'll brace it against the hull and stop it from moving away from the other gear and potentially skipping. Now that everything's installed, we can use the drive to properly adjust the clutch system and the steering system. Go ahead and start with the clutch, and the first step is to put the drive in place, and then with the release handle released, pull up on the drive and see if it's difficult to remove. If it is, which this one is, it's likely that there's too much force between the gear on the drive and the gear on the clutch. And that's because this rear bolt is too tight. Loosening that bolt will allow that clutch gear to move away from the drive. So I'll go ahead and remove that 1 turn, push it in a little bit. You heard that click. That's just that thread on that bolt pushing back into the hole. And I'll go ahead and test it again. That feels much better. I think I'll release it another half a turn. Try it one more time. Again, pushing on the gear a bit to make sure it's seated further away from the drive. Yeah, that's nice. Basically, it should be just the weight of the drive to pull it up, or just a little bit more. But if you're feeling like it's really stuck at first, then it's likely that that friction is due to those gears binding on each other. Now that that's adjusted, we're going to adjust the clutch brace screw, which is on the back side of the clutch system. And for this, you're going to want the drive installed. And what you want to see is, as you install the drive, that clutch gear will move a little bit away from the gear on the drive. It'll press against it. And as that happens, the whole clutch system moves towards the side of the hull. And you'll see that screw that comes out of the back side of the clutch move closer to the plastic of the kayak. And what you're looking for is you want that screw to just barely be touching the kayak. So when the drive's out, it shouldn't be touching. And when it's in, it should just move a tiny bit closer. And in this case, it looks really good right now. But if you need to make any adjustments, you take a 5/16 wrench, feed it in through this crack, and if you need to move it closer to the well or to the hull, you back it off like this. If you need to move it away, if it's binding, you can tighten it again and it'll pull back towards the clutch mechanism. The last adjustment to make on the clutch is the front clutch bolt, but that can't be done until you're on the water. What you want is you want it to be loose enough that in the case of hitting something underwater or dragging the boat on the beach or somebody grabbing the lower unit, you want that whole thing to be able to slip. And when that happens, like I'm pulling on the lower unit right now, you can see the indicator moving, you can see the handle moving, and that's bypassing the clutch. So if I tighten it up, one turn, let's say, or half a turn, and I try to do that again, it's much stiffer, it's much harder for me to turn. So the idea is, as you're pedaling at a brisk pace, you don't want the drive to move back and forth. You don't want to see that indicator move 30 degrees back and forth every time you pedal. So if you see that happening, you tighten it a quarter turn and you retest it. In this case, I had it tightened all the way, backed it off about one turn, and that's a good place to then take it to the water and try it out and see how it works. If you then need to tighten it because the drive's moving on its own, you tighten it a quarter turn, test it again, tighten a quarter turn if necessary, and then you're good to go. After you finish adjusting the clutch system, you can adjust the compression tube to get the proper tension on the steering belt. You should have assembled it with the black line facing up on the compression tube, and that means it's in its most compressed state. Normally you're going to be adjusting this somewhere between 45 and 90 degrees. And the way to do that is to open the center hatch and reach inside. And in this case, we're going to be adjusting that line so it's pointing out to the left side of the kayak. You want to do that just because it's easier to see it. If you were to adjust it the other way, it would still tension the belt, but it would be harder to see that line. So to do that, I'll put my hand inside, and you want the steering box to make sure that the screw on the steering box is still loose, so it allows that compression tube to twist. I'll put my hand inside, knuckles up above the tube, and twist those knuckles away from me. And then I'll keep an eye on this, and it looks like we're at about 60 degrees. So I'll back it off just a little bit, and when I back it off, knuckles down, I find is the easiest way to do it. So we'll start there. We'll start at about 45 degrees and see how that feels. So what I'm going to do is put the drive in place, and then go ahead and use the steering. What I'm looking for is any sort of locking or binding or ratcheting noise, which would mean that those teeth on the belt are catching that internal spacer or one of the end components. It feels pretty good. There we go, I got it to lock up. So that means we need to put a little bit more tension on it. So right now we're at about 80 degrees, which means that the line is almost totally on the side of that tube. Try it now. The downside to over-tensioning it would be you're going to start to feel more friction in the steering system because of all that tension adding to the friction. Again, I'll just be a little bit more violent with this and see how it is. If you feel it catch, you don't want to then grab this and try to force it, because that could actually damage the system. So what you're looking to do is just put some force on it and see if anything happens. That feels really good, so I'm going to leave that there. The last step with that is to go ahead and tighten the 5/32 bolt on the compression tube, or on the steering box, and that'll just make sure that it stays where we set it. And it'll also keep the steering box in line with the compression tube. All right, that's nice and snug. That feels good. Last step is to replace the foam. We have 3 pieces that we took out. I'll start with the one that goes in the gunnel. Remember, that one has 2 screws that run through it, and it fits between the steering box and the BOA here. So I'll go ahead and slide that in place, making sure you don't catch any of these lines or anything as you're pushing it up. That's good. Go ahead and put those screws back in place. The second piece of foam goes on the back side of the compression tube and butts up against this piece of foam here. And it also wedges between the compression tube and the underside of the deck and stops these handles from moving up and down. So go ahead and feed that in like this. Here we go. Okay. The last piece goes directly underneath this seat mount with this V-notch up and supports the seat. You'll notice that the compression tube actually fits inside of that V-notch as well. Now that we've got everything reassembled and adjusted, just keep in mind that the first time out in the water, whether you water test it or whether it's the customer, you may need to make some more adjustments to the clutch slip or the compression tube. So keep an eye and ear out for any strange movements from the drive as you pedal, any motion back and forth. You may need to tighten the clutch slip slightly, or with the steering system. If you're hearing any irregular noises or if it's catching or binding, you may need to tighten the compression tube to get the proper tension in the steering belt. So keep the 5/32 key with you on the water or inform the customer of those adjustments that might need to be made.